The student-centered movement in teaching has influenced me, I would say, on two levels. On the first level is how it impacts how I see myself as an instructor, moving away from the sole expert in the room, in which students essentially engaged in what I call a game of intellectual hide and seek. They would try to guess what I wanted to hear and how I wanted to hear it. And I was complicit in that game early on in my teaching, and it really didn't lead to meaningful student engagement or learning. And so I realized when I started learning more about student-centered teaching that it really required a change in how I approached teaching myself. And so moving away from the sole expert into a boundary spanner in which I see myself as a bridge between students' own prior experiences that they bring into the room, the interest they have with the topic, and the actual topic itself, the profession that they're preparing for, in this case, teaching. And so what I try to do in that case is orchestrate experiences in which students would actually have legitimate experiences developing their own identity as teachers. And that was facilitated the most through use of simulations in my class, and also having field-based experiences where students could actually go out into the field and start seeing themselves in the profession that they were preparing for. The kinds of simulations I use in class prepare them for moments in the classroom that we talk about, or themes or concepts that we talk about, but that really have an experiential component that you need to experience. So for example, one of the simulations that we use in my class is we talk about how oftentimes teachers will dismiss unexpected ideas. And all of my students don't want to be a teacher who's going to dismiss students' ideas out of hand. And they all will say, I don't want to do that, and I won't do that in my teaching. But unless you're confronted with that and really experience it, it's hard to really know what you will do and how you approach those moments. So what I typically do is set up a simulation in which students prepare a little mini lesson, and then I actually plant students in their lesson who are going to say unexpected things. And then they themselves get to monitor and reflect on how well they dealt with those unexpected experiences, what they did well, what they might do differently. And so I found that using simulations, having a field-based component in an applied profession like teaching, really helped bring my course alive and make it much more student-centered. So that was on one level. The other level that really I started thinking about in a move to more student-centered teaching is thinking about three things. One is, how could I help my students relate more directly with what is being taught, seeing themselves in the content? Now, fortunately, in my class, all the students have gone through some prior schooling experience. So I was able to, from the very first day of class, have them start reflecting on their beliefs, assumptions, images of everything that we're going to cover in the class. Because they don't come in as tabula rasa, as blank slates. They have very rich prior understandings and experiences. And so I want to surface those from the first day of class and throughout every activity that we do in the class. So one of the first questions I have on any assignment is, what are your prior understandings about this topic? What have been your experiences with motivating students, for example, or grading, and so on? And so I try to situate students right in the center of every learning activity in my class from day one. In addition to connecting them to the subject matter, the other thing I try to do is provide students with some sense of choice or self-directed learning. I think one of the things that's really difficult in moving to student-centered teaching is trying to also let students direct their own learning in many cases. And so ways to do that are providing choices for students on how they will approach an assignment or how they will represent their understanding. When we do group activities, I let them choose how they're going to represent the subject matter that they're covering. So for example, they could do a PowerPoint, or I've had some students actually bring out a guitar and write an original song and deliver the content in that way, or come up with a more artistic skit or poem or what have you. And so I think by doing minor modifications to assignments that give students a choice, they're much more inclined to feel like they have some ownership and direction in their learning. And finally, I think what's critically important in moving towards student-centered learning is helping students understand that they all have a chance to be successful in the class. And so I try to demonstrate to them that this isn't a class where you're going to be graded as compared to other students. It's really about you making progress on the goals in the class and providing the kind of feedback that helps them know where they are coming in, where they are in relation to the goals, how they're making progress on there, and so that they themselves can see, Are they being successful, and what does it take to be successful in this class? Developing relationships with students. I think this is absolutely critical in any teaching endeavor, and particularly in large classes where students can feel invisible and anonymous. And frankly, for a lot of students, this may be the first time they've ever been in such a large, overwhelming situation, learning situation. So I think trying to establish a relationship in which students feel like they belong there, and most importantly, that their instructor sees them and cares about their success in that class, is absolutely essential to engaging students in meaningful learning. And there's a couple things I do that are pretty simple, but I've found to be very effective, and I've heard back on my teacher evaluations that students really appreciate. From the first day of class and then every subsequent class meeting, what I will do is usually come 5 to 10 minutes early, and instead of just zipping down to the front of the room and setting up my stuff, I will circulate around the room and just check in with students, ask them their names, welcome them to class, welcome them back to class, notice things about them, like if they have a broken arm, like what happened to your arm, are you doing all right? And just those simple things of connecting and letting students know that I see them and that I appreciate them attending class goes a long way in helping students feel connected and welcomed in the class. And then during lecture, when we're having class discussions, when students share their ideas, what I will first ask them to do is share their name. And so when I then paraphrase back what a student has said so everyone can hear it or I can elaborate on it, I will first attribute it to that student. So I will say, as Georgianne said, and I will repeat what the student said. And then I will return to those comments as well and link comments up. So for example, Georgianne was bringing up a point that Ron saw very differently. And so they again hear their names, they realize that I'm listening to them, I know who spoke, and this can even be done by remember 1 or 2 comments from one class period to the next. So on Monday, for example, if Georgianne said something that was particularly compelling or relevant for the next class meeting, I might revisit that at the outset of Wednesday's class meeting. Say, you know, Georgianne brought up a really important point, and so did, you know, Larry, for example. And so students get a sense that I'm really listening to them and hearing them as people talking, even though there might be 200 students in the classroom. I think those are simple things that we can do to develop relationships in the class. I think we also need to communicate to students and demonstrate to students that we respect them as individuals and that they have lives outside of our classrooms. That, again, I think goes a long way in having students be engaged in what we're trying to teach and be respectful of the class space that we're in. So for example, when I set out my assignments on my course syllabus, I somewhat arbitrarily picked the due dates, dates that just seem like they're equally spaced out or something like that. So it's more aesthetically pleasing than meaningful at the outset. And so what I'll let my students know is I realize that they have lives outside of the classroom. And there may be some course assignment due dates that are just not ideal for what's going on in their lives outside of class. And so what I will negotiate with my students is, as long as they contact us prior to the due date, and when I say us, myself or my GTFs, and demonstrate the professionalism that they know this due date's coming up, but they're not going to be able to get the paper in on time, then we will give them an extension, no questions asked, a 7-day extension. And students will respect that, and I have rarely had a case where a student will take advantage of that situation. Now, if a student continually asks for extensions, I will let them know that I will check in with them and see, is there something going on, right? To see, there might be something going on where they need to take a break from the class or so on. But in most cases, students really respect that kind of flexibility that really doesn't have a huge impact on my instruction, and it communicates to them that I realize that they have lives outside of class. And when I do those kinds of things, students are much more respectful of general class procedures, like not having your cell phone out or not texting when somebody's talking in class. On the rare occasion when that does happen, what I try to do is, even when I'm lecturing, I try to move about the room, and if I notice a student is texting, I will literally lecture right near that student. And I mean, that's an uncomfortable thing to have your instructor standing in close proximity, and so they often will remember or get the cue that they're texting and they're being disruptive, and they'll put that right away. But I would say in most cases, just by setting up a respectful climate from my end where I initiate that, students oftentimes will reciprocate and be very respectful. My class really focuses on challenging students' assumptions. One of the key things that I want them to be prepared for is to come in with an open mind and be willing to take risks. And so that involves just being present in class itself. And again, out of the respect thing, I let them know that they're adults. They can choose whether or not they want to attend my class. But I'd say I want to try to make this sufficiently compelling for you to attend. And if you do attend, I want you to be ready to be a participant in this class. And so one of the most challenging things I think instructors face, and I certainly faced, is getting students to complete readings prior to class. And what I found is if the readings are particularly theoretical or arcane or abstract, it's really difficult to have students dive right into those readings and come prepared and confident in discussing something that they may have seen for the first time, language that they're not sure about, and so on. And so what I found is really effective if I know those kinds of articles are coming up or chapter readings, that I will do a pre-lecture on the readings first. And so that students have some shared understanding and context so that when they go into the readings, they are encountering vocabulary that we've already discussed in class, that they already have a general kind of big picture idea of what this article or chapter is trying to discuss. And so that's one thing I've done that seems to increase students' willingness to read and then later participate and share the readings. The other thing that I've done to ensure that they actually participate is, again, rethinking my role. Rather than having them participate with me checking their understanding, what I typically will do is have them work in small groups and have them be accountable to each other. So for example, if there are 4 readings or 5 readings, I will have them group into groups of 5 and self-assign a number 1 through 5. And then one of them will be responsible for reading number 1, although they'll be expected to read all 4 readings. And then they will have to present that to their peer, a summary, key points, what they thought was confusing and what they thought was compelling. And then as a group, we will cover all 5 readings. But when they have to be accountable to their peers, when we're spending class time in small groups where they go around and they have to share their understanding of the reading and their peers are counting on them for that information, I found that they're much more likely to have done the readings. And then I, of course, follow up and check understanding in the whole group. So doing things like that, even with, I do micro presentations in a group of 200. There might be a presentation on different teaching strategies or assessment strategies or different concepts. I'll have them present in that same sort of format, where they'll present 5 different things, each one taking one strategy, for example, presenting to their peers, providing a handout to their peers, and then we as a large group will go over all 5 strategies together. So that kind of format where you kind of make the class a smaller space and they're accountable to 4 other peers makes it much more relevant and likely that students are going to be participants in the class. As far as clarifying what my objectives are for the class itself and each particular class meeting, I found that it's really useful to break it down into big themes. So I will usually break my class down into 3 or 4 large themes, the entire class syllabus. And then each class meeting I will try to break it down into 3 or 4 themes. And so what I recognize is that students, again, have lives outside of my classroom. And so it's really important that I reorient them to what we're discussing in the class. And so I will usually spend the first few minutes of class reminding them of where we've been in the discussion so far, or what context this class is, or what we're trying to do in this class in this particular context, and then also where we're going. So it's a very simple where we've been, where we're going. And then throughout the course, if after point 1, for example, I will quickly check students' understanding. And one of the benefits that I have in teaching prospective teachers is I can use techniques that they might use in like an elementary school classroom. That might seem odd for a college classroom, but it's a quick way to check understanding. So for example, at the end of a theme or if we're reviewing for an exam, I can ask students just by a show of thumbs up if they really feel like they have confidence in what we covered and they understand it, thumbs up. If they have absolutely no idea or confused, thumbs down. Or if they're kind of somewhere in between, you know, thumb in the middle. All right. and as cheesy and elementary as that sounds, is a very quick and effective way for me as an instructor to get a gauge of where students are, particularly before a review session for an exam, for example. I will do that first thing before we even talk about the exam. How are they feeling about the subject matter that we're going to be covering? And then I can do that midway through the review session and at the end. And by identifying the places where they're not comfortable, if there's a large portion of students, we can focus right on that. Now, there will always be some students who, even after a review or we've discussed the concepts, still don't feel comfortable. And what I will do is invite them to stop by after class to meet with me. Now, I realize that students have to leave to meet buses or other class schedules. So if this is a review session or if we have an assignment coming up the next class meeting, I'll usually end class about 10 minutes early to invite students down so that they can actually get the help they need with me right then where everything's fresh, rather than trying to schedule office hours. And what I found is that students will usually take me up on that. I'll usually have 5 or 10 students that will come by with legitimate questions right after class that need help, and we can usually clarify it on a one-on-one basis. Whereas when I used to just put up office hours, students would rarely, if ever, attend, even though I knew they still had questions. So those are the ways I try to monitor strategies. I mean, if someone didn't feel comfortable doing the thumbs up, thumbs down thing, and I can certainly understand why they wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. The electronic clickers, I've done it with those as well. You can get a quick gauge of where students are and particularly what questions they're doing well on or where they might need some more help. But I think that's essential to check that out periodically, certainly before an assignment's due and certainly before an exam during a review session, for example. So I think engaging students in a class that size is difficult, and it's particularly difficult for students who are shy or don't feel comfortable talking in front of that many students. And I think one of the key things to do from the outset of the class is really invite students who would not normally participate in the class to volunteer and take risks. And I think the way to do that is to model. I try to model myself as being somebody who's still in a constant state of learning, that if I don't know something, I'm not going to try to avoid that. I'm going to acknowledge it and talk about how I might find out more about that topic. And so I think when students start seeing that I'm willing to take intellectual risks in the class and other students are, they're much more likely then to take risks themselves. And so I think having those kinds of conversations, recognizing that not everyone's going to be comfortable participating, yet inviting those particular students to do that. So I will say things in my class, for example, when I need a volunteer for a simulation or role play, I'll say who I want to volunteer for this is somebody who this is the absolute most dreaded thing you can imagine. That if you come down here, you might feel like you're going to pass out or vomit. I want you to come down here. And if you pass out or vomit, we will get you help. But I want you to try to take those kinds of challenges because that's really a way to learn this material and to grow in this area where you feel uncomfortable. So I'll invite students to do that, but even those that refuse to do that still, I recognize that there are other alternative ways I can still get shy students to participate and feel more comfortable. So there's a couple things I do. Like I mentioned earlier, I'll have them pair share where they can share with 1 or 2 other students their ideas, and then I'll have those one representative from a group share out the ideas of the entire group. So at least their ideas are getting voiced, even though they're not comfortable to do that. At the end of most class meetings, I'll have an exit reflection, which is a 1 or 2 minute reflection, where they might reflect on something they have a question about, something that's unclear, something that really resonated with them. And what I'll do is I'll read those, and usually I'll learn the students' names who participate. And so I'll try to share out in the next class meeting some of the comments or ideas that were brought up by students who I haven't learned their names yet, who haven't been participating. I'll do that in an anonymous way and somewhat of an aggregate way. I'll say, here's a couple things that students have said that they had questions about that are unclear or that were really compelling, and share those out. And when students hear their ideas being shared out, I've found that they're more likely then to actually participate, and those are students that again start learning their names more quickly, and they've kind of come out of the shadows and become more visible in the class. And the other thing I use is Blackboard. I use forums where they can discuss with their peers, where they can do reflections and send those to me, and so that they always have multiple opportunities to share their voice, either in class in small groups or through virtual means, and then always trying to encourage them to share their ideas throughout class. But I realize there's a continuum of comfort, and not all students are going to feel comfortable doing so. So trying to provide many opportunities for success, I think, is critical. And that's what I try to communicate to them, that although we all have the same criteria on these assignments, there are multiple roads into Rome. And that might mean that you, instead of doing a class presentation, you're going to do an iMovie. And we'll show that iMovie if you feel more comfortable doing it instead of standing in front of the entire group. Or if you want to collaborate with somebody on something, you can do that. And so I try to create many different ways for students to be part of the class, represent their ideas, and importantly, feel comfortable and connected to what's happening in the classroom. I've used a variety of different assessments. Some of my classes do require, in my opinion, more traditional types of assessments, paper and pencil assessments. In many other cases, I use a variety of different assessments, but some of my undergrad classes certainly have had multiple choice type tests with short answers, because I feel that there is some information that students just need to have kind of walking around knowledge. The first thing I try to do is minimize the pressure of those assessments. So in other words, I think it becomes problematic if those are so high stakes, like if you have one or two high stake exams where if you blow this exam, it's over for you in the class. I think you're going to see higher instances of cheating, or the temptation to cheat might be greater for students. So I try to minimize the threat to their survival in the class of those types of exams by having a multitude of different assessment points. So at most, an exam might be worth 15, maybe 20% of their grade, but usually 10, 15%. So even if they completely botch it, they could still feasibly pass the course. So that's one thing. The other thing that I try to do is I try to provide the blueprint of my exam as we go through all the courses, all the different lectures. So by the time we're at an exam point, if we've gone through 5 weeks, when I do an exam-based course, I will actually hand out a little overview of each lecture where they need to fill in information and so on. So by the end of 5 weeks, they will have essentially a blueprint of the themes that we're going to be covering. And what I think is incredibly important is that we don't assess them on things we haven't taught them, right? And so even if there's readings that are outside of class, I think that students need to be aware of what they're being held responsible for. So there shouldn't be any surprises on the exam, in other words. It's not that I give the questions away, but I basically then take and create a study sheet based on all the lectures that we've had and say, here are the key themes that you're going to be held responsible for on this exam. And that literally is the blueprint by which I develop my exam. So I'll take a theme and write questions based on those different themes. And it will actually follow that order, and it's the order that unfolded in the class. So again, no surprises, and students kind of appreciate that this is what we covered in week 1, and their questions are going to be based on these things. If it's not on the review sheet, it's not going to be on the exam. And so I give that review sheet well in advance. I encourage them to study together, and then I hold a review session where I have them come in and walk through that review sheet, and that's where we do the thumbs up, thumbs down section. And I can get a quick sense on like week 2, information from week 2, what's your level of comfort. If everyone's comfortable with that, then we'll move on to a place where they're not. And so I'll try to clarify. And so again, eliminating surprises, and also letting students feel comfortable that this isn't going to be a big deal, that they feel confident taking this exam, and then taking care of student accommodations. So students who have special learning needs are going to require test accommodations. There are also some students who might not have documented disabilities, but who just know themselves, and they are worried about distractions and so on. And so I might have a GTF and have a smaller room available where 20 students can break off and take the test in a larger room where there's not so much crowding and then there's not so many potentials for distraction. And then the other thing I talk about is it's just not worth it for them to cheat. One thing to think about is, for me, what was really helpful, because prior to coming here, I taught as a graduate student at Indiana University, and I had smaller classes. I always taught much smaller classes. The largest class I taught prior to coming here was 40. And so teaching a class of 200 was a large leap. And I had a fundamental decision point at that point, which was, do I try to change everything that I do in order to teach a larger class, which I had no idea how to teach, or should I just try to teach this like I would teach a class of 40 or 30 or 20? And so that's the route I took. I decided I'm going to approach the class of 200 as if there were only 20 students in here with respect to types of activities that I might try to do. Well, then you quickly run into constraints, like the seats are bolted down to the floor. And usually in the class of 20, you could have students arrange into groups much more easily. So what I will do is request breakout rooms for my large classes, or just have students sit on the furniture in a way that it's not intended for them to sit. So we try not to let the environmental constraints get in the way of good teaching and learning. And so I have them break into small groups or use breakout rooms so that we can have a class of 200 divided across 3 larger classrooms, so they have more space to work in small groups, particularly when they're doing simulations and so on. And I found that by treating it in that way, by genuinely trying to connect like I would if it was only 20, 30, or 40 students, that I've actually been able to figure out ways in which to make that class very similar to the classes that were much smaller that I used to teach, and not compromise the kind of teaching and interactions that I would if I just decided to stand and deliver a more traditional lecture format.